And thank you once again for joining us for the Great Lecture Series. Our featured speaker tonight is relatively new to Chadron, Nebraska, along with his wife. Mr. Rich Kenney is an assistant professor in the social work department, and he's also the director of the social work program. He has a master's degree in social work from Texas University and also a Bachelor of Arts degree in radio television production. Interestingly, before joining the academics, he was a Little League center fielder. Told me that. Also a radio talk show host, a newspaper columnist, and of course a social worker. The title of his talk is Poemhenge, Poetry on the Rocks. He is going to read some poetry, and he is also going to have some of his stellar students read some poetry. So it's just an incredible delight to welcome you to Chadron State College and also introduce you to the Great Lecture Series. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. And thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased with the turnout. I'd like to first introduce some of the students that will be reading some of the poems this evening. And we have 4 students. We'll start with Val Rares. She is a former student here at Chadron State College. She's a graduate from our social work program, 2 or 3 years ago?
Almost, let's see, since 2009.
Oh, okay. And she's the director of Camp Norwesca here in Chadron. So very honored to have Val with us. We also have Jazzy Seumalo. And Jazzy will be graduating in May from the social work program. And Jazzy also has a great interest in singing. And last fall, the students put on a conference here at the college on PTSD, and a number of veterans were there. And we opened up that conference with the national anthem. And Jazzy she's as good as anybody I've seen. Super Bowl, NBA championships. I mean, she can sing. We also have Mustafa Barry, and Mustafa is a junior. He'll be graduating a year from May, and he's in a number of our social work courses. And it's always great to have Mustafa because he is new to Chadron. He comes to us from Gambia. And he's always, whenever he shares his experiences in Gambia, it's just such an incredible insight that he has. So we're very glad to have Mustafa. And we also have Megan Kizer. And Megan is, are you a psychology major?
I'm a social work major.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. Because I saw psychology and I was thinking, oh, we have to get her into social work.
I'm a psychology minor. So
okay.
You're right. Close.
And Megan is also a singer, and she does some performance poetry, so I was very glad to learn that. But welcome to the 4 of you, and thank you for coming. Sean?
One last thing I forgot. I'm going to pass this around. I tried to catch those of you that are attending, but I didn't catch all of you. So if you would sign in, I would really appreciate it. Can I just, I'll be a student and pass it around. Thank you.
Okay, and again, thank you for coming, and let's start with the presentation. This is called Poemhenge, Poetry on the Rocks. And I do believe that some of my students must think I have rocks in my head with all the poems that I feed them. But like those massive, mysterious bluestones, those enormous boulders that found their way to Stonehenge about 5,000 years ago, I sometimes wonder how mine arrived. And I guess it started with a kite that was stuck in a tree. I was about 8 years old, and I wrote about this kite after being knocked down by the neighborhood bully. And I remember the pain and the struggle to get up. But what hurt most, once I did get up, I remember how the bully slammed me to the ground again. And I was in great pain, but despite the pain, what really bothered me, what hurt most was my pride. Being taunted, being singled out by the bully, and then being the feeling of embarrassment in front of my friends. A few days after this incident, I remember seeing that winged kite trying to get free from a tree. And it was in front of my house in a little town called Braintree, Massachusetts. And from my bedroom window, I stared out at that tree, and I stared out at that kite, and I watched it struggle to get free. And for the first time in my life, I wrote a poem. And I realized that when I did that, when I wrote, the pain went away. So for the first time in my life, I had tapped into an inner healing place, a place that I would return to over and over again. As Sean mentioned, I teach in the social work department, and I've worked with a number of populations over the past 30 years. I've worked with homeless people. I've worked with kids with developmental disabilities. I've worked with blind children. I've worked with residents in nursing homes. And I recall my earlier days listening to the emotional stories of people. And there was the young woman who had lost her husband to cancer after just 1 year of marriage. And she was describing to me how hard it was for her to get up each morning, how she would just stare for hours at his pillow that she kept next to her. And I remember the tears in her eyes, and I remember the growing lump in my throat, when all of a sudden, the guy sitting next to her on a bar stool swung around and spilled his beer all over her sleeve. Then there was the fellow who lost everything to a house fire. And everything he owned in a house fire, he was trying to explain to me how that felt, what it was like to lose everything, when out of nowhere, a waitress appeared calling for flying grasshoppers and margaritas. Yes, before I was a social worker, I was a bartender. And after listening to the many stories of pain, the people's endless questions of where do I go from here, I realized that serving them drinks wasn't necessarily in their best interest. I thought that perhaps I could do better serving them with shots of Nye or Bly, maybe a few jiggers of Dickinson. Instead of Beam or Cuervo, how about a little Pinsky or Plath? So way back when, tending bar at the Montponset Inn, I thought one day I'd write a book, or at least put together a presentation and call it Poetry on the Rocks. When Sean asked me to do this presentation, I thought, finally, I have a chance to put this title into work, into play, until I recalled a visit I made to Alliance, Nebraska. And my colleague and friend Bruce Holm, who I work with in the social work department, he was giving me a tour of the Scotts Bluff and Alliance areas. And he was introducing me to the different field placement supervisors we had down there. And we spent the whole day down there. And on the way back, just before we were leaving Alliance, he said he wanted to show me one of the local attractions. And I remember he said something like, "You're probably familiar with Stonehenge, aren't you?" And I immediately thought of that giant clock-like formation of rocks. But I realized I didn't really know much about Stonehenge. I would later research it and learn that Stonehenge was a place of many theoretical origins. It's a place of observation, a place of burial, but most importantly to me, it was a place of healing. Anyway, we pulled into the parking lot of that local attraction, and there in the distance was a majestic circle of metal monoliths, a magnificent formation of automobiles that would have humbled even Click and Clack from NPR's Car Talk Radio. It was Carhenge. And I don't know if have any of you been to Carhenge in Alliance? It's an incredible sight. And I had no idea that such a place existed. So right here in Alliance, Nebraska. And I realized that if there could be Carhenge, there could be Poemhenge. And after all these years, I finally had a name for my inner healing place. And I now had a name for this presentation, Poemhenge, Poetry on the Rocks. Now, I believe that we all have healing places. Mine happens to be Poemhenge. But there's also Songhenge or Brushhenge. For my Uncle Frank, it was Wrenchhenge. And I remember as a kid, I'd go over to visit him, and I'd walk in there to the garage, and the first thing I would see would be his legs sticking out from some old Chevy or Buick that he was working on. And without missing a beat, he would say, "Hand me that wrench there, Rich." I'd later write a poem about him and all that clatter and the tapping underneath the car and call it the Morse code of mechanics. Now, to paraphrase poetry therapist John Fox, poetry is a natural medicine. Reading and writing poems is a way of seeing and naming where we have been, where we are, and where we are going with our lives. It's about surprising yourself with your own words of wisdom and being surprised by the poems of others. And that's one of the things I like about poetry is the surprise, the element of surprise, and also discovery. Robert Frost wrote, "I have never started a poem yet whose end I knew. Writing a poem is discovery." For many of us, it starts with a blank piece of paper, an empty page. And for me, especially during my days of the Mont Ponset, it started with an empty cocktail napkin like the ones I put here on this table. You can use these, by the way, for notes or if you have any ideas for poetry. I can't tell you how many cocktail napkins I went to as a bartender. On a slow shift, I'd write up several dozen. I'd write down all my ideas and snatches of poetry, and I'd put them in a neat little stack at the end of the bar. All my notes and ideas in blue ink. One day I was horrified. I went down to the end of the bar and all my napkins were gone. All my notes, all my fresh ideas. Later on during the shift, when things got busy, a waitress comes up to me and she says, "What's with all the new cocktail napkins? All my tables are like study groups." So there were all my ideas. According to Fox, the blank page is capable of receiving the pain and hidden feelings that you may have kept buried too long and now need to express. The empty page won't strike back at you, and the poem you create will be a partner in the healing process. And this is when new insights really do come to light, insights that you might not discover in traditional therapy. Now we're going to start off with our first poem for the evening, and Val is going to read a poem called "To a Piece of Paper." Val?
To a Piece of Paper by David Wiley. Here is to the landscape of all possibility, whither the obverse of either. Here is the window of a universe unborn, where the mind's fugitive seed seeks a hidden orifice of creation. Here is the battlefield. Here is the scented bed. Here is the palace, dazzling in all of its lack of plumage, where something unknown wants to live.
Thank you, Val. What I like about that poem, too, is the very first line and the last two really sum up what it is. Here is the landscape of all possibility. And as you look at these cocktail napkins or a blank piece of paper, that's what it's all about. It's a possibility. Here is the landscape of all possibility where something unknown wants to live. In her book, Writing Through the Darkness, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Maynard Schaefer talks about how putting one's pain about depression into words can be very healing. She says, "It helps us identify our feelings and separate ourselves from them. The primary goals of writing to ease depression are these: the exploration of yourself and your relationship to your world, and expressing what you find." This is one of her poems, and Jazzy's going to read it. It's called "To Depression."
To Depression by Elizabeth Maynard Schaefer. Ghost-like, you watch me in my morning shower. You hover in the corner of the kitchen. You sit seductively on the soft sofa, wearing an evil smirk, beckoning for me to spend my precious hours there with you. I feel you beside me as I drive down 101, doubting anyone has ever loved me. And at the cocktail parties you delight in, you dress up and slip between people to poison my Chardonnay. You always find me easily. Though I scramble from you like my timid cat who dives under a flat bedspread, thinking her lump invisible. But I also fight your clever attacks. I gobble pills like M&Ms. I let people hold magnets and electrodes to my head, slip needles into my scalp, and you skulk away for days or weeks. Still, you spy, and when I start to relax, you return in the night to watch me sleep and swaddle me in your web of grief.
Thank you, Jazzy. Margaret Robinson, with a poem from a book that she wrote called The Healing Journal, puts into words her thoughts about life after a stroke. Mustafa will be reading After My Stroke.
After My Stroke by Margaret Robinson. My right side feels lonely from my left side. The two sides of my body are like a husband and wife who stay together for the sake of the children. My left arm no longer listens to my brain. It has gone to sleep.
And one more poem about strokes. This one is written by Mike Lowry, and this will be read by Megan, called Stroke.
Thank you. All right. Stroke by Mike Lowry. The clock stops ticking. The book slips from my hand. The doctors echo in a white room as I try to think of the word for snow. My life becomes a clean sheet on an empty bed. I speak in tongues to captors who carry flowers, and I ask for pillows, and the nurses bring me pudding.
Hope is so important in the person's well-being. It's vital to the healing process. It can help a person to get back on the right track. To me, hope is an adventure. It leads the way to what's next. This next poem is one by poetry therapist Nicholas Mazza, and it's from his book called Poetry Therapy, in which he explains that clients are not asked to identify the true meaning of the poem, but rather the personal meaning. For in poetry therapy, the focus is on the person, not the poem. Jazzy will read Hope.
Hope by Nicholas Mazza. Hope is the belief that one hand reaching to another can eventually touch the moon, allowing the light to guide us through the night. Thank you.
Another poem that especially inspires me is one written by Naomi Shihab Nye. And I mentioned to you earlier as a bartender that I thought that perhaps I could help my customers better by offering them shots of Nye or Bly. So here is a shot of Nye called The Writer by Megan.
Thank you. All right. I have The Writer by Naomi Shihab Nye. If a boy told me if he roller skated fast enough, his loneliness would catch up to him. He couldn't catch up to him, I'm sorry. Best reason I've ever heard for trying to be a champion. But I wonder tonight, pedaling hard down King William Street, as if it translates to bicycles. A victory! To leave your loneliness panting behind you on some street corner, while you float free into a cloud of sudden azaleas. Pink petals have never felt loneliness, no matter how slowly they fell.
Thank you. One of the goals of poetry therapists is to try to create a safe environment for individuals. Jerry Chavis and Lila Weisberger, co-authors of The Healing Fountain, help trigger poems for their clients by asking them questions like, where were your safe places as a child? Where are your safe places now? Ted Bowman responds to these questions with his poem called Safe Places, and Val will be reading this one.
Safe Places by Ted Bowman. As children, Our games included safe places, bases where we were safe and free, lines that the monster intruder could not cross, areas off limits, out of the games, parents around whose legs we would wrap ourselves around and yelling, "You can't get me! I'm safe here!" Now older, I'm still looking for safe places. But the fears inside seem to know the safe places I seek. They wait there patiently for my arrival. Courage and faith, my only legs to stand on.
I think we all can probably think of some safe places that we had as kids. And one of mine, ironically enough, was in a closet, and it's called Light Years Ago. In a time when neighbors built bomb shelters, I found one already set up, my safe haven, beneath a row of wire question marks, below sleeve and pant crease, way back beyond PF flyers and a loafer's loose penny. With Captain Midnight's flashlight pen, I sat for hours in my closet on a heisted milk crate, crammed with comic books, reading baseball cards and Bazooka Joe bubblegum strips. Behind my uncle's hand-me-downs, I stashed an old cream cheese jar filled with treehouse keys, fishing lures, and a few of my father's beer cap tops. It was the one time I had answers. Sitting there in the black until the pen went dead. Sitting there with a glow-in-the-dark Jesus and a pale, dry bottle of fireflies. Although most of the places I visit in my childhood are safe ones, there are some that are not. And one such place was, and in all places, an elementary classroom with an impatient teacher and J.D., my best friend, who stuttered. The only time he did not stutter was when he sang. This poem is called Silent Partners. I used to speak up for J.D., whose mother drove him to stuttering school on Saturdays, after which he joined us in pickup games, his arrivals like his check swing speech. It was the year we shared desk and dislike for Miss Lynch, who picked on him in arithmetic. Quickly now, mister, 3 times 2 times 5, snapping her fingers, his mouth caught in a numbers crunch, his speech reduced to fractions of itself. He became spelling bee phobic, uneasy with consonants like hard C's and silent K's. When classmates dubbed him stumble mouth, I learned to misspell with purpose, only too glad to join him in the first round sit-down row of wasted teachable moments. One time in chorus, though, I thought I heard lyrics roll, words at work without hard hats. J.D. was having his say. But tunes at odds with a pitch pipe never played in a Miss Lynch sing-along, her shoulder tap sentences of silence, book closing blows, leaving us empty-handed without notes to hold or tunes to carry. Miss Lynch was a rather intolerant teacher, and if you could not spell with lightning speed, you had no chance in her spelling bees. And worse, if you could not carry a tune, she would tap you on the shoulder during the group sing-alongs, at which point you were supposed to close your book and stop singing. And I can, to this very day, remember her prowling down the halls or the aisles, listening with her ear very close to your voice. And if you were off-key, you'd get the tap, and that meant not to sing. And ironically enough, my friend J.D., who stuttered, that was the only time he did not stutter. So it was a remarkable experience that something like that could happen, but it did. When I remember J.D., I think of the poet Jimmy Santiago Bacca, who was abandoned by his parents. And at the age of 13, he ran away from the orphanage that he had been living in for years, or his first 13 years. He was convicted of drug charges at 21 and spent 5 years in prison. His work now is concerned with social justice, addiction, and life in the southwestern barrios. And Megan is going to read a few paragraphs from his piece called Coming into Language, which can be found in an anthology called Doing Time, 25 Years of Prison Writing.
Ashamed of not understanding and fearful of asking a question, I dropped out of school in the 9th grade. Most of my life I felt like a target in the crosshairs of a hunter's rifle. When strangers and outsiders questioned me, I felt like a hang rope tightened around my neck and the trapdoor of a creek beneath my feet. There was nothing so humiliating as being unable to express myself, and my inarticulateness increased my sense of jeopardy. In prison, I met men, prisoners who read aloud from such works as Neruda and Nervo and Hemingway, and never had I felt such freedom as I had in that dormitory. The language of that poetry was just the magic that could liberate me from myself and transform me into another person and transport me to places far, far away. When at last I wrote my first words on the page, I felt as an island rising beneath my feet, like the back of a whale at a place to stand for the first time in my life.
Miss Lynch, the teacher I told you about, would have done well to use some praise poems, the kind that Linda Christensen uses with her students. In her book called Reading, Writing, and Rising Up, she explains how praise poems encourage students to praise themselves, their people, their culture, their language, their schools, their neighborhoods. And in writing about themselves, students learn to praise their own attributes that often have been overlooked or held in contempt by society. She shared this poem written by one of her students, Aaron Wheeler Kay. It's called I Got the Blues, and Jazzy's going to read this one for us.
Blue eyes. Yes, ma'am, blue. Like the ocean. No, blue like new jeans, stiff and comfy. No, blue like hard times. Yeah. Blue like cold steel and oil. Blue like the caress of jazz at a funeral. Yes, blue like lightning in a desert storm. Blue like twin sapphires blazing in a jeweler's palm. Blue like cold lips in winter. Indigo stains in an optical vein. I got the blues, and they got a tale to tell.
I'd like to have been a student in Linda Christensen's classes. Here's what she has to say about poetry. Poetry needs to dust its knees and hurry to the nearest basketball court to shoot a little hoop. Jump rope on a crowded asphalt playground, scrawl graffiti on bathroom walls, get off the shelves and into the lives of kids. Poetry is held too sacred, revered a bit too much to be useful. Someone lied to us when they whispered, kids hate poetry. Kids might hate the poetry that rustles in old pages and asks them to bow and be quiet when they come into a room. They might hate reading poetry unlocked only by the teacher's key, but give them poetry that presses its ear against the heartbeat of humanity, and they're in love. Another poet who has a lot to say about poetry is Kim Rosin, who is the author of Saved by a Poem. And what she says I like a lot. She says, spending time with a poem is a way of choosing what you will do with your attention. When I focus on a poem I love, my thoughts stop spinning, my body relaxes, and my breathing finds the rhythm of the poem. When I read this passage for the first time, I thought about the 2nd century philosopher Patanjali, who had a lot to say about inspiration. And he wrote, "When you are inspired by some great purpose, some extraordinary project, all your thoughts break their bonds. Your mind transcends limitations, and your consciousness expands in every direction. You find yourself in a wonderful new world." Years ago, I worked as a newspaper columnist in Arizona, and there I was able to interview and write about many inspiring individuals. There were all kinds of people. There were Braille transcribers, fighter pilots, guide dog trainers. There was the 92-year-old softball player who refused to let anybody pinch run for him. And there was the bell-collecting woman who was a Marine Corps drill sergeant in World War II. But the one who had the most to say about inspiration was a Scottish bagpipes player who told me how marching in parades inspired him. This is what he told me. He said, "I remember marching in the back of a band one time, and all of a sudden I could see the whole band come together. All the kilts were swaying, all the pipes were swinging the same way. It was quite a moment. Sometimes it never happens in a parade. Sometimes it won't happen at all. But when it does, you can march forever." A good poem should make you want to march forever. It can take you on a journey in which time seemingly stands still, and many times it can lead to healing. Try this one on for size. Pieces of a poem by Bob Hickok. It's called Meteor Shower, and Megan will read it.
All right, Meteor Shower by Bob Hickok. It's the one shower that I take a year. Naked in the field with skeletons of corn. To get clean, you need something out of this word like, stars. In truth, they're rocks. I mean, we call them stars to speak kindly of the dead. When they fall nearby, I hear a fizz. Makes me think of the universe that is made of like champagne. If you wash with light, you can rinse with air. It's good for the complexion. Real stars are the womb of everything, pebbles and the bright logos of tropical fish, and naked in the field, if you ask the long-legged corn to dance, a twirl is certain. Who can resist this hot music and these ballroom lights?
Shakespeare said, "Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak." This next poem shows how to stay in touch with someone who has passed on. It's a poem by Dorian Kotler called List, and Val will be reading this one.
List by Dorian Kotler. Since you've died, I've been coming across things that would interest you. An article in Scientific American about language, how it evolved out of nameless dark. A gadget for making coffee inside one's car. A poet whose lines ring like cracks through ice on a pond in March, as yours do. An all Vivaldi concert this coming Friday. The list will grow longer. Meanwhile, I keep it here at my desk, handy, on grief's tall spindle.
This was a poem that Ms. Kotler wrote for her father, and it's a poem that I would like to maybe take some ideas from about my father, who passed away not too long ago of Alzheimer's. And every so often when I think of things that happen, the things I see, I think of him, and she does it so well with this poem list. Poetry therapist Alma Marie Rolfe's mother died when she was 26 years old, and as Alma aged, she realized how much she looked like her mother. And she wrote a poem called Reflections. Mustafa will be reading this one.
Reflection by Alma Maria Rolfes. My mother once told me I was just like her. What did that mean? Was that a triumph? Was it a curse? She glimmers at me now from store windows, unexpected mirrors, sudden reflections. Always, she takes me by surprise.
Sometimes we lose the ones who are still living. As a social worker in an Arizona nursing home about 15 years ago, I used to work closely with Alzheimer's patients and their families. And it used to break my heart when relatives of our patients would come in and tell me that their loved one no longer recognized them. I wrote a poem called Mittens, and it describes this sad experience. It's about a woman who used to steal latex gloves from our nurses' med carts. It would drive them crazy. She would steal everything she could get her hands on, but would always later give it back. And this is called Mittens. The woman pilfered latex from unattended med carts. Mittens for nor'easters, should tell me, twiddling rubbery thumbs. She lived in pleasant confusion, bundled for the chill, with lap quilt and sweater, though mercury cooked at 90. She traveled with tea bags and face wipes, her saddlebag chair stuffed with lobbyway plunder, her pockets replete with greeting cards lifted from the in-house gift shop. She gave them to strangers, the nurse, the therapist, her husband of 60 years. Once she handed me one with best wishes for a prosperous new year. In the exchange, I noticed the photo on her blanket. There she was, a snow angel in a Beantown blizzard. The caption, "A Colleen at Cambridge." She studied it, looked at me, and asked, "Where did she go?" as I handed her another pair of mittens. Exploring relationships through writing can be very healing. In this next poem by Gladys Wellington looks at the speaker's relationship with her mother and the subject of sibling rivalry. It raises the issue of a parent's favoritism and the behaviors of children that capture a parent's attention. It's called I Wanted to Be a Cauliflower, and Val will be reading this one.
I Wanted to Be a Cauliflower by Gladys Wellington. I wanted to be a cauliflower when I was a child, so my mother would love me. I, too, was bland, like her favorite vegetable, with no hollandaise to give me verve. But she looked right past me to my sister, who led a pastrami life all over the world. Years have passed. The pastrami's turned green, and I've found a bit of sauce for myself. So now when my mother comes to visit, I offer her hot chili peppers.
Thank you, Val. Now, this next piece is one that is a prose poem that was triggered by a story my wife Linda told me about her many efforts as a child to get her parents to watch her dance, which is her passion in life. When we first met 8 years ago, she talked me into taking some ballroom dancing lessons with her. Eventually, the lessons would lead to our marriage and a waltz at our wedding. Now, Linda's here, and she has several of her friends from the stepsisters who have seen her dance. I haven't seen the stepsisters dance yet, but I plan to do that soon. But anyway, this is called A Reason to Live. We were learning to make poetry in a box, but it was Linda with the exquisite verse and flowing meter. She was teaching me how to dance, a waltz for our wedding. Box steps, tilts, and turnarounds. She was a ballroom poet. Her moves, graceful alliteration, and sublime assonance. It's easy, she told me, the first time she took my right hand and placed it on her waist. What she didn't know was that rhythm for me was a labyrinth of broken line breaks. I was clumsy hyperbole, a moose in a ballroom sonnet shop. They never watched me dance, Linda used to tell me, referring to her parents. She wanted them to see her clever steps, her sweeping turns, her elegant twirls. She wanted them to feel her elation, her passion, her reason to live. She wanted them to applaud her final bow. Once she planned a recital for her mother in the kitchen, who disappeared into another room to iron. While her father read a newspaper, she left the house and danced for the neighbor next door, who patted her on the head when she was finished. At our wedding, everyone watched us dance. It was a waltz, a poem, a reason to live. She didn't know I wrote that. So she heard that for the first time. I contemplated maybe not reading. I don't know if I could get through it. Humor is always good to follow up after a story like that. Humor can help very much in the healing process. When a close friend of mine from high school died several years ago, I decided to write a humorous incident that we shared. Phil Rando and I went to a Catholic high school back in Braintree, and it was during a time when Madras suit jackets were popular. It was also a time of big nuns and big black habits, and some of them were very intimidating, like Sister Philip Joseph, our English teacher. Rando, however, was not so easily intimidated. Sister Philip Joseph, she had many phrases, and one of them was ham bone. And she would call on you in class, and if you did not know the answer, you'd have to stand up. And once you were asked a question, if you did not know the answer, she would say, "Sit down, ham bone." And so she would make you really feel terrible. But she got a lot out of us. This is called ham bones. "Sit down, ham bone," she growled at the hulking football lineman in the back row. I swallowed hard and looked over at Rando, sitting next to me. He grinned and mockingly whispered her favorite expression, "Sweet mother of the light." "Mr. Rando," he banged his knee against the bottom of his desk as he clambered out of his chair to answer the big sister in black. It was Philip Joseph, our freshman English teacher, who was more intimidating than any starting pitcher on the Boston Red Sox. The southpaw fired blazing questions tempered with drop-dead change-ups that could make you look silly. PJ moved in on Randall like bad weather. He squirmed as the nun grilled him with questions not even Shakespeare could answer. Humbled but not broken, Rando did a quick penguin waddle before sliding back into his seat. I wanted to laugh, but instead slipped on a counterfeit face and intently turned the pages in my literature book as if Shylock's next soliloquy was all that mattered. The hefty left-hander prowled the aisles, looking for her next victim. The only sound we heard was the rattle of her rosary beads. When they sideswiped my elbow, I took a deep breath. The kaleidoscopic Madras jacket I was wearing proved to be poor camouflage. Although my nose was pressed to the book, Sister Philip Joseph's ominous shadow hovered over me. I knew she was staring, most likely hypnotized by my suit's screaming colors, an all-in-one mosaic of pink, navy, orange, yellow, and green. Spellbound by the coat's magnificent geometry of lines and bleeding radiance, she pinched my shoulder. "Sweet mother of the light," she said, scrunching a wad of the fabric. Did this come with sunglasses? Rando, unable to resist a good comeback, quipped, just a blindfold. Without loosening her grip or looking away from me, her other hand shot out like a cobra from somewhere under her habit and yanked his earlobe so that his head tilted sideways, his right ear crushing a contraband muffin. Slowly turning her head, she glared at him and said, smart guy, eh, Rando?" "No, sister." Then meekly, "Just a ham bone." Kim Rosin, from her book entitled Saved by a Poem, shares a poem written by Naomi Shihab Nye. So this will be another shot of Nye for you. And she talks about finding kindness, but by first losing everything you have. This is a condensed version of her poem called Kindness, and Val will be reading this one.
Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties our shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend.
Writing about nature can also be a powerful healing force. Henry Miller wrote, "The moment one gives close attention to anything, even a blade of grass, it becomes a mysterious, awesome, indescribably magnificent world in itself." Sometimes poetry from the angle of nature helps us to find and make surprising connections between things, as in this poem by Jan Kenyon. And Megan's going to read Peonies at Dusk.
White peonies blooming along the porch send out light, while the rest of the yard grows dim. Outrageous flowers as big as human heads. They're staggered by their own luxuriance. I've had to prop them up with stakes and twine, and the moist air intensifies their scent. The moon moves around the barn to find what it's coming from, and in the darkening June evening, I draw a blossom near, bending close, searching it as a woman searches a loved one's face.
We'll close with this last poem. It's written by Jilly Bolton from her book Writing Works, and it really sums up my feelings about writing and about healing. And it's called Take Care. Mustafa will be reading this one.
Take Care by Jill Bolton. You are about to enter a danger zone. Wear protective clothing around your heart. Take off your shoes. Writing can seriously damage your sadness. Writing can seriously damage your nightmares. You are in danger of achieving your dreams. Once started, you won't be able to stop, nor will you want to. And others might catch it too. You are in serious danger of learning you are alive. You are in serious danger of laughing out loud. You are in serious danger of loving yourself. If it gets in your eyes, consult with your loved ones. If it gets in your mind, counsel your therapist. If it gets in your heart, hold on tight.
Very nice. So these are some of the poems that I found in researching poetry therapy, and so many of them really do have that healing nature. There actually is a field where one can become a certified poetry therapist, and I mentioned John Fox, Nicholas Mazza, who wrote the poem Hope. They are leading people in this field. And I just really discovered the fact that it's a therapy field not too long ago myself. And one of these days, if I can find the time, I think I'd like to become a poetry therapist because I have always enjoyed therapy. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that the focus in poetry therapy is on the person and not the poem. So if you're in a poetry workshop, many times you analyze the poem, try to discover its meaning. But in poetry therapy, it really is about the person's interpretation, the person's belief about what that poem means to them. Oftentimes in a poetry therapy session, a person might not even discuss their feelings because it's so personal. Whereas in a workshop, a school setting, of course, students are encouraged to participate. Over time, though, an individual in a group poetry setting might come around. They might be able to understand their grief a little bit more. I think that poetry has such a great way of learning. It helps you to discover things about yourself that you may not have previously known. It helps you to see the world in a different way, in a different lens. It helps you sometimes to feel that grief that maybe you've buried under layers within yourself, and to be able to feel it, it needs to come out. And if you can take that chance, if you can take a look at that empty blank page or the white paper or this cocktail napkin and fill it with some of your ideas, it's incredible what can surface. Do we have any poets in the group or people who like to write poetry? Val is one. I'm sure there might be others. Yes. No. Tiffany. Yeah. Do you write for therapeutic purposes or just because you love it?
Taking a course in independent study, it helps get the ideas of form.
It helps bring.
Imagination concepts.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes we learn things about ourselves that we may not have realized before. I'd like to just ask some of the students what their thoughts were in reading these poems. When I asked them to read poems, they selected the ones that they liked. And anything that you'd care to share during your experience of reading these or learning more about them? Val, come on up.
Do you want me up
Sure,
here?
come over here.
Okay.
Speaking to the mic.
My experience with these poems, I actually had a lot of fun with them. Through the time that I was rehearsing these poems, I actually shared these poems. I got to share them with my niece, and we had a poetry evening. She's on the speech team at the high school here, and so we shared our poems back and forth, and we had a lot of fun. And then this past weekend, I got to visit with my mother, and so I got to read the whole list of poems that we had to choose from, and so I just read them all, and we had fun with that. So I had a lot of fun with it.
Thanks.
I'll come over next.
Sure.
There were a lot of poems to choose from, and they were all really, really nice. I just was moved by a lot of them because they all touched on different kind of aspects of life, and they were really just the way they were worded was really a beautiful testament to how, you know, people can speak and things like that. So I really enjoyed that. And when Professor Kenney mentioned it in class last week, I was just like, that's not something I've done for a while, but I really enjoy doing poetry, and that's not something I've done for probably like 3 or 4 years. So I'll go ahead and give it a try. And all the poems were just so different but so wonderful. So I mean, it was a really interesting experience, and something that I would recommend to a lot of people, because it really does give you the option to look into a lot of different avenues and things like that. So
Mustafa.
What I realize is every language have poetry. In my language, I can say it's my mother tongue. We don't write it, we just speak it. But there are people who will speak. I will ask, what are they saying? I won't know the meaning at all. I didn't know what it is until when I get to school. When I read English books, I know the meaning. I read poems, sometimes I don't know the meaning. And it's English. I'm like, okay. When I get further into my education, I get to know what poetry is. I was in a speech team for a while, but I never took poetry because I thought I'm not good enough for poetry. In class, when the professor mentioned about this, I never thought I would participate. But I was the last person to leave the class. He asked, would you want to participate? I gave it a thought. I said, okay, I will. Finally, when I saw the poems, I chose one which is reflection. It reflected what I feel right now. My mom is away. My family is away. And this poem talks about someone who is away. And I'm always hoping that I will visit my mom with a surprise. Thank you for sharing that poem with me.
Thank you. It's just incredible if you give yourself the opportunity to read poetry and the feelings that it can bring out of you. You know. Oh yes, well, Jazzy, I haven't forgotten you. But I was just going to say that what you just said was just I thought very, very heartwarming. Thank you, Jazzy.
I can't top that. No, I'm just kidding. No. The first poem that I read to depression, mine is more on a personal level. This was the first one I chose, and I just thought we had to read one. And then when he said to pick 2 or 3, I was like, oh my goodness. No, but yeah, poetry for me, I haven't written in so long, and I've kind of been on like this, I guess, writer's block, and I just haven't really expressed a lot. But when I was given the opportunity, I was like, man, this is good, because then I can just start getting my ideas flowing. And like you said earlier, it's not about the poetry or about the poem, it's about your personal like connection to it. So, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming and listening to some of these poems and to think a little bit about the healing power of poetry. Yes, sir.
Are you about to answer this?
Oh, no, sure. If you would like to say a few words, you're very welcome to.
Going back to World War I, that's not quite my age yet. The poem that always fascinates me is the Flanders Field. And I don't need to copy.
Would you like to?
I'd like to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
In Flanders Field, the poppies grow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up the quarrel with the foe. To you from trembling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. Thank you.
You know, that's another aspect in poetry therapy is if you can find a poem that you can identify with, a poem that really has that emotional connection with you, to memorize it. And it's something, once you memorize it, it's always part of you. It's a place that you can retreat to. You can read it to yourself or recite it to yourself, or, you know, in a case like this, recite it in a gathering like this, which I think is a wonderful thing. But to take the poem, one or two, and really make it yours. And the more you recite it, the more you learn from it, other ideas, other perceptions come about. It's quite a magnificent field, I believe, poetry. Any other thoughts before we close? Okay, well, again, thank you for your attention. I really do appreciate your coming.